Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to today's Friday Reflections on this, the 11th of September 2020. I hope everybody is well. And yeah, I hope everybody is well. I'm looking forward to the weekend. Today is a day when we remember a tragic event that occurred 19 years ago. But I've already posted about that today, and this isn't what I wanted the Friday Reflections to be about. I was browsing through some of my books earlier, and well, that might seem like a little unexpected topic for the day. I think also it's important that while we don't forget what happened 19 years ago, we are living in 2020 now. And we don't let it over-dominate our lives at the same time. So my day hasn't been all about 9/11. But obviously I did post something. But I was reading this book, Islam in Britain, from 1558 to 1685. And I know it's a book I bought a little while back, and it's something that I've been keen to read, not really getting much time to read it. But I also get asked a lot, like yesterday when I was, Assalamu alaikum, how are you? I'm good, thanks. So yesterday when I was doing the sobeh for the dhikr, I was asked about what it's like to be a Muslim in Britain. Now, obviously, people who are British, they must know Muslim people. You know, if they live in any of the cities, they must know Muslim people. People who visited Britain, visited any of our cities, would probably have met British Muslims. So they would know that British Muslims are here. But if you're living in another country, in Pakistan or Indonesia, or even somewhere like France or Australia or somewhere, you might not realise that there is a thriving Muslim population in Britain. And that it's not just something that has only recently emerged either. I think this is one of the mistakes a lot of people make, because during the 1950s and 60s, there was a migration to Britain from around the Commonwealth nations, from the Caribbean and from India and Pakistan, and elsewhere, Bangladesh as well. So because people came from these areas and were in significant numbers, very quickly the Pakistan diaspora overwhelmed the number of British Muslims from varied backgrounds who were here beforehand. Now, I'm sure this wasn't something that they intended, it was just something that happened. And I'm not saying anything more than just stating that it happened. But there were British Muslims before then, and this goes back a lot further than many people might realise. Back in the 8th century, there was actually a coin discovered which has the Shahada on it. So this is the declaration of faith within Islam. So I mean, this goes back to all the way back to the 8th century. And I'm going to talk about a later period, which this book discusses, because this book starts from 1558. So this is obviously much later than the 8th century, but we're still talking about a time about 500 years ago. So we are going back quite far, and there were British Muslims 500 years ago. Now, the part that I wanted to read today starts on page 34, and it's actually titled British Converts to Islam. And I'm going to start from the next paragraph under the title. The first English converts to Islam whose name survives, the first English convert to Islam, singular, whose name survives in an English source, the voyage made to Tripoli in 1583, was a servant. a son of a yeoman of our Queen's Guard. His name was John Nelson. Henceforth, in travel literature, converts always appear, especially when ordered by their captors to convert their compatriots to Islam, as was the case with Nelson. In the mid-1580s, and as a result of tensions with Spain and the subsequent decline of trade with Germany, English ships ventured into the Mediterranean to compete for Venetian and Turkish trade. Divers ships were captured by North African pirates, and divers sailors were forced to turn Turk. So these particular cases were, there was obviously some coercion. In April 1585, William Harborne, the first English ambassador in Istanbul, wrote to Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's secretary, about Hassan, king of Argier, his renegade, taking our ships. This reference to an English renegade in high office recalls Laqaid Jafar, renegade Anglais, who had been mentioned by Diego de Haido in 1581. So this, when they say renegade at this particular period in time, so we're talking Elizabethan times, about 500 years ago, they actually meant people who were formerly Christians from European countries who converted to Islam. Now, there were different ways that people may have came into Islam, which are detailed in the previous chapter, which I'm not going to read simply because of the length. But in summary, some people were pressured into converting to Islam, such as the Janissaries. But this actually ended not long into this period of time. So at some point during the 16th century, this was actually ended. And the Ottomans decided to employ more Muslims into the military instead of converted Christian children. So that period of Janissaries from Christian backgrounds didn't actually last all the way through. But then there may also have been some of the pressured conversions. So this is one category. Another category were people who were enslaved, because slavery back then, it was everywhere. It wasn't just any particular group doing it, and that sadly, Muslims were among them. And some people who were captured as slaves, they converted to Islam because they thought it might, if they had Muslims who were owning them, they thought maybe they would be more inclined to release them. And sometimes this was the case, and sometimes it wasn't. And sometimes people were freed who were Christians. And then there was another category of people who converted because they were drawn towards Islam. So there was these different categories of converts. And I guess, where you have an official religion, this would be the case elsewhere. I mean, even during the British Empire time, you would have people who converted to Christianity because they thought it would bring them some benefits, and sometimes it probably did. And other people who retained their own religions. So why it should have been any different for the Muslims, But anyway, so there was this guy who was actually a Muslim convert who was in a high office within a Muslim community. And he had been mentioned by Diego de Haido in 1581. In 1591, John Sanderson visited Istanbul and observed many Englishmen, old and young, have in my remembrance turned Turks, as Benjamin Bishop, George Butler, John Ambrose, and others. Now, when they say turned Turk, this was another term that they used to mean that someone had become a Muslim. H.R. mentioned in 1593 in News from the Levant Seas an Englishman turned Turk in some favour with the King of Algiers. When Thomas Dallam went to Istanbul in 1599 with a gift of a musical organ to the Sultan from the Levant Company, he met in Algiers with a large number of renegade Christians. Most are Spaniards, Italians, and other islands adjoining. Later in Istanbul, he met a Muslim who was a Cornish man born. In that same year, one Albert True, an English renegade, was captured by a Venetian ship, and in 1609, George Wilkins described an Englishman who forsook Christ to follow Muhammad, and from a Christian turned Moor. And Moor is a term they used to describe Muslims. Sir Henry Middleton referred in 1612 to the youth of Mr. Pemberton's who had converted to Islam, and Lithgow mentioned an English renegade named Wolston who he met in Crete, and it was an Englishman who became a famous corsair, Jafar, in 1630. Sometime after 1610, 46 Britons who had converted to Islam were captured at sea, while in November 1616 it was reported to the East India Company that a servant had capitulated his soul to the devil by turning a cursed Mohammedan. Capitulated his soul to the devil. Seriously, what did they think of Muslims? In 1619, the author of the Relations of the Christianity of Africa, and especially of Barbary and Algiers, published by Purchas, noticed that between 1609 and 1619, the highest number of renegades came from Lower Germany, 857 renegades, followed by 300 from England. In 1622, Sir Thomas Roe, the English ambassador in Istanbul, reported that 2 Englishmen had converted to Islam by force and frailty. In that same year, John Rawlins included in his famous and wonderful recovery of a ship of Bristol a reference to the above 100 handsome youths compelled to turn Turks, all English, and to John Goodall, an English Turk, Henry Chandler, a Chandler's son in Southwark, who had adopted the name of Ramatan Rais, Richard Clark, who had changed his name to Jafar, George Cook, who had become Ramadan, John Brown, who had become Mehmet, and William Winter, who had become Mustafa. A year earlier, in 1621, William Ezer, 12 years old, had been captured by the Barbary corsairs and converted to Islam. In 1622, Thomas Herb, 9 years old, was captured in the English Channel, and in 1623 Andrew Williams, 7 years old, was captured too. None of these children returned to England. In May 1625 there was a report of the English and Flemish renegados, and in 1626 Francis Barnes and Barney, the pilot of a Tunisian ship, and Robin Lockar of Plymouth, who had changed his name to Ibrahim and was known as the English Mammy, were captured by the Spaniards. Each had been a Reis corsair captain among the Algerians. In 1630, John Harrison reported about an English renegado in Salé, and in 1631 about a renegado of Dartmouth. Writing about the Moroccan ruler Abdul Malik in 1633, Harrison mentioned that the letter had caused some English boys perforce to turn Moors. Harrison later added that Abdul Malik's successor had forcibly converted 8 Englishmen to Islam. In 1635, two Scotsmen were captured by Spaniards on a Turkish vessel and were detained because they were renegados. A year later, two Turkish pirates, Turkish 6699, Mohammed and Hamed, who were captured by the English Navy, reported that they had sailed a Sally ship with 5 renegados, one of whom was English. In 1638, Robert Blake brought on his ship 3 renegados and later met an Irish renegado who was captain of a Sally ship. In 1641, Emmanuel Doranda referred to an Englishman, but a renegado, who was among the Algerian pirates that captured him, and later he made one of the rare references in English sources to a Turkish woman who was an Englishwoman. During his captivity in Algiers, William Oakley referred to an Englishman who turned a renegado, and in 1643, John Talla, an English renegade who was known by his Muslim name Solomon, who was captured by the Spaniards. In September 1643, 7 pirate ships from Barbary landed in Cornwall and were led inland by some renegade of the country. In February 1651, a report submitted by the ruler of Rabat mentioned the English renegade Richard Pensel and 2 Irishmen, John Jeffrey and Peter Moores. In 1655, mention was made of Solomon Res, un renegat native de Ireland, who was a captain in Algiers. In the Adventures of Mr. T.S., published in 1670, but describing his captivity in the late 1640s, there is mention of an English renegados and of a renegade Cornishman. So it would seem that during the 16th and 17th centuries, there were in fact a lot of people who were converting to Islam. It wasn't just a few. In the Restoration period, Charles II sent Captain Hamilton to ransom some Englishmen who had been enslaved in the Barbary coast. The captain was unsuccessful in his mission because the men had converted to Islam and did not wish to return to England. They are tempted to forsake their God for the love of Turkish women who are generally very beautiful, he wrote. In 1669, Sir Thomas Allin was ordered by the king to try and capture English renegades from among the Turks, and in November of the same year, a resident in Fez alluded to an English convert that had been in the country. After describing apostasy among the Christians, because of course from their perspective it was apostasy, in Greece, Reichaut record the poor English men who have fondly and vilely denied the faith of Christ in Barbary and some parts of Turkey, and become, as we term them, renegados. In August 1670, Sir Edward Sprigg, Admiral of the Mediterranean Fleet, referred to one Brown, an English renegado who was sailing with the Turks. In January 1672, John Luke described how Brown, the English renegade, docked in Tangier for supplies. In 1681, Thomas Baker of the English consul in Tripoli referred to Hassan Aga, who, before his voluntary turning Turk, was named Edward Fountain of a good family in Norfolk, as he pretends. Later in the year, he recorded Hezekiah Ware of London mariners aboard the Charles, Peter Wall commander, about a year since in the port of Alexandria voluntarily turning Turk, which is not uncommon to our drunken, hard-headed sailors. So, yeah, I mean, there's a number of cases here which are mentioned of people who were very, very keen to convert to Islam. They were not people who were just, being pressured. Some of them were, maybe, in some situations. But a lot of these people seem to be voluntary. I mean, it's quite telling that mission that was sent during the Restoration period by Charles II, where he sent Captain Hamilton to bring back some Englishmen who'd been enslaved initially in the Barbary Coast, but that they'd actually become Muslims, settled down there, and married Muslim women, and were quite happy and didn't want to go back to England. That is quite telling. And these other cases where people are described as voluntarily turning Turks, and I think this particular comment, which is no uncommon accident due to our drunken-hearted cities, but it's not uncommon. They're saying there was a number of people who had become Muslim. And of course, if it was really because they were drunk, like they're suggesting here, then surely they could have just got back on a ship and went back to England. Nobody would really chase them up on it. So it was obviously more than that. They even mention here in his autobiography, Pitts mentioned an Irish renegado who had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and an Englishman by the name of James Gray, who had converted to Islam and become so well versed in Islamic law that he became a zealot. So, this person, probably he wasn't a zealot, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but the fact that he was described as a zealot and become very well versed in Muslim law indicates he would probably become a scholar, which is something interesting. An English scholar in 1682. I mean, this goes on page after page. The author, Nabil Matar, obviously did his research. Obviously, I'm not going to read all that, but certainly, if you're interested in the early history of Islam among British people, this book, Islam in Britain, 1558 to 1685, by Nabil Matar. It was published in 1998 by Cambridge University Press. So it may well be out of print now. I'm not sure if this was a second-hand edition that I bought. I forget now. But it's definitely worth a read. It's well worth getting hold of. And it will reveal many things that you would find probably surprising. And it tears apart this myth that some people have, that the so-called Muslim world and Christendom, or Europe as it is now, were somehow at odds with each other and were not actually all the while in communications, and things were always going on. Ambassadors were always traveling from one country to another country. I mean, as it mentioned there about the English ambassador who was in Istanbul, there would have also, prior to this period, I mean, obviously in 1492, the Muslims were kicked out of Spain, but prior to that, in the early 15th century and beforehand, for around 1,000 years, there was Muslims ruling a large part of what is now Spain. And of course, when that was the case, there would have been diplomatic relations between the royals in this particular part of Spain and people from their courts, and the English courts, the French courts, the Italian courts. It would have happened. So it's not just something that's happened recently. And it's interesting as well, because this particular period that this book is detailing, from 1558, so it's 16th and 17th centuries, this period was still, you had, I mean, they talk about this guy who was a Muslim, John Gray, who converted to Islam and become a zealot. But I mean, a lot of these Christians were zealots. They thought the only way to God was through their particular denomination of Christianity. I mean, it wasn't even just Christianity, which obviously is a beautiful religion and has a lot of wisdom in it. But they were, if they were like Anglicans, they would think that Catholics they don't have anything, that they're misguided. If they were Catholics, they thought Anglicans were misguided. Probably in the eyes of Catholics during that period, wouldn't have made much difference whether you were a Muslim or an Anglican. And this may have been one of the things that brought the English and the Turks more close together. And some of the other things that are actually discussed in this chapter are about the diplomatic relations between the Ottomans and the English court of Queen Elizabeth I. And this is something which is often not discussed these days as frequently, but it is part of our history for right the way through from about the 16th century up until maybe the mid-19th century. Still there towards the end of the 19th century, but it had weakened significantly. For that period of a good 400 years or so, the English and the Ottomans were actually allies. So you imagine if two countries are basically allies and they're working closely together, then how much interaction would have been going on? It wasn't just like two completely separate worlds. And of course, they were natural allies, because the threat to the Ottomans came from the Vatican at that time. And the threat to the English came from the Vatican too. So they supported each other in that period. And unfortunately, this is not something that's discussed today, because I think if people discussed this history that is shared and the agreements that were made, the agreements between Elizabeth's court and the Ottomans, that if they captured people who were English, or they captured ships that had English people on who had been caught by the Spanish, that they would return them back to England. And vice versa, if the ships had Turkish people on or Ottoman citizens, they would be returned to the Ottoman Empire. So, I mean, this is something which is really not discussed today. And we've instead often reading a narrative of worlds apart and, civilizations, clash of civilizations. But was it really? And when we actually delve into the history ourselves, we find that it was less of a clash of civilizations and more of an interaction. And I'm not saying all of the interaction was positive, but it certainly wasn't all negative. And it wasn't this us versus them narrative that we are being fed today by extremists on all sides. And going back to the fact, yes, this is September the 11th, and I'm talking about people converted to Islam, but I'm also talking about the interactions between the Ottomans and the English, and the fact that historically there were good relations. Also, there were good relations between the Americans and between a lot of Muslim states as well. So it's not something that is historical, that Muslims have always been opposed to Europe, or that Muslims have always been in conflict with Christians. And of course, this is notwithstanding the large number of Christians who have lived within the Ottoman Empire or lived within the Middle East, and a number of them still live there. So, and that was even more, before these ISIS people started causing trouble. And of course, they killed a lot of Muslims as well, because they're just extremists. They hate everybody. And then, of course, you've got these far-right extremists that are on the rise across Europe, who they also hate everybody who doesn't conform to their narrative of some kind of white supremacy and white nationalism across Europe, which itself is a relatively recent phenomenon, because historically, they were more about, people being English or being German or being Italian, both ethnically and culturally. Now it's got to the point where it's some kind of white nationalism. They're more like a white version of ISIS, which is insane and doesn't make much sense. I mean, extremism always exaggerates and always creates conflict, because the only way they can exist is that they create an enemy. I mean, if everybody's getting on fine, regardless of their faiths, regardless of the colour of their skin, regardless of their national background, if everybody's working together and getting on fine and has a good impression of people of other backgrounds, extremism cannot thrive in that situation. But if extremists can convince that people who are Muslims are bad, or people who are Christians are bad, or people who are Jews are bad, and create that enemy, then that's when extremism thrives. They need that. They only work when they can create an enemy and say that these people are evil. These people are after us. These people we must fight. So this is what we need to be on our guard, and not let that happen. We don't want any more September the 11th. We don't want any more ISIS. We don't want any more Nazi Third Reichs. It's in nobody's interest. We all live on one small planet, and we need to make it work for us all and for all our families. First and foremost, before whatever faith we accept or believe, first and foremost, we're all human. And whatever we differ is dwarfed by what we share. So, and the fact that we differ as well is a beautiful thing. We shouldn't think that that's necessarily something which is itself a problem that can stop people from coming together, because often if we learn to appreciate differences, we can learn from each other and benefit and enrich ourselves and our lives and our cultures, which is beneficial for everybody. Anyway, I wish you all the very best. I hope you all have a lovely weekend, and until next week, may Allah bless you all and grant you support in your lives and any difficulties which you are going through, and grant us all to become more enlightened and to understand our histories better and understand ourselves better and understand our human family better, that we may come together and build really vibrant, diverse societies that are best and beneficial for everybody. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم صلي ربي وسلم على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين. الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.